Hi, my name is Piper Harris, and welcome to the Untangled Mind podcast, where I help you untangle your mind to untangle your life's challenges. On today's episode, I talk about a process of reconsolidation in conjunction with exposure therapy and how it has been found to cure people of fear. You don't want to miss this one. Thanks again for joining the Untangled Mind podcast. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. It is the first day of February. It's hard to believe that we are in full throttle of 2024. I hope everyone is healthy. I am just recovering from the flu. Boy, I tell you, I'm not good at being sick. My husband tells me that I'm very whiny, but the other thing is that I sleep a lot and I don't like it. I don't like watching the hours tick by. Obviously, I recognize that my body needs to sleep, but it's irritating. I'm not good at sleeping like 12 to 14 hours a day. So I hope that you are staying healthy. So let's get into today's subject. Today, I really want to talk to you about renovating your emotional house through exposure and reconsolidation. So what this is about today is really based on some groundbreaking research that was done by Dr. Marelle Kint and her team at Kint's Clinics. This is a Danish clinic, which really has transformed the approach to therapy for anxiety, phobias, and trauma-related issues. And this approach really, it's not necessarily new, but I wanted to be sure to weed out some of the confusion and actually explain how I've been using this with my clients. If you are listening, some of my clients, you don't know this word reconsolidation because it's one of those, therapy words that really doesn't do good. I know sometimes when I start getting into talking about, the brain and how we're activating different regions, I get this like glossy-eyed look from my clients, and I know I've gone too far down the therapy ease talk. So for those of you that do work with me, you've not heard of this word, but it's exactly what we do, and I'll explain that to you today. So first, let's start off. Some of you listening, you may or may not have heard of what exposure therapy is. So what it is it's a method that I use to expose people to their fears or stressors gradually and repeatedly. Okay, so why do I do this? Well, it's been proven to be effective in reducing that avoidance of that feared stimulus, which means it reduces the anxiety and the fears over time. So it can be at times very challenging, and it can sometimes be a lengthy process. I use this method with phobias, like I said, like heights, anxiety, for example, like crowded spaces or driving on the freeway. I also use it for trauma, including, molestation, rape, war, and also for grief. I think a lot of people are very surprised that come to me for bereavement counseling or grief counseling, and I explained to them that we're going to take part in a exposure process, and they think, "What do you mean? I was there, I lived it." And so, really, what this is about in exposure therapy is the premise is that we expose you to that thing that you feared and that you're avoiding, which is causing behaviors and symptoms that are distressing to you, and we expose you to that feared stimulus. So, example might be you're afraid of a spider. We would expose you to it over and over again. So then what your brain says is, I don't like spiders, but I'm not going to go into full on panic and screaming out of the room, if that makes sense. So what I want to say is with everything when it comes to exposure and reconsolidation, it is a tough process. You do need to be with a clinician that knows what they're doing and can keep you safe. Because one, it is highly, highly effective for trauma therapy, for trauma-informed care, for anxiety, all of those things. But it is difficult. It is difficult. So you need a therapist that recognizes what they're seeing during the exposure therapy, how to bring the client out of the exposure session, and how to help them with the soothing and the regulation of their autonomic system. So back to Dr. Kint's work. So her research really focused on this concept of memory reconsolidation. So memory reconsolidation is a process where our brain actually revisits and updates our memories. So when we recall a traumatic experience, there's this temporary state where that memory is malleable, and it gives us the opportunity to modify the emotions attached to it. So Trauma creates intense emotions, anxiety, intense emotions, grief, intense emotions. See what I'm saying? So that intensity of emotions is what creates the distress. So what we found in this memory consolidation is that there is this really kind of cool moment in time where we can temporarily change or rewire our memory. And so this is not us forgetting the memory. I tell my clients all the time that when you go through exposure therapy and the reconsolidation process, this is not erasing the memory. It is always with you. This event, this thing has always been with you. It's been there. What we're doing is there's this really prime time is that we are reconsolidating it, restructuring this memory. And it's a fascinating process. So, in essence, really what it does is it gives us this opportunity to update and revise your emotional responses associated with your memories, the ones that are causing pain and distress. And as we will explore this more today, this complex process, I do want to dive into the science and discover how our brains craft entirely new responses, new emotional responses that have the potential to relieve you from anxiety, stress, trauma, or grief. So, at the core of reconsolidation is the idea that memories, once they're formed, are not set in stone. For years, I'm talking years before the early 2000s, we really thought that memories could never be altered, that that was it. But now we know that after recalling a specific memory, it does enter into this temporary, malleable state. What's very fascinating by some of this research, not only by Dr. Kint, but others, is that they've identified it's about 10 minutes to 5 hours. That is your window where that memory is very malleable. And so in the counseling session, what's so very important is I go through exposure with my clients. We go through our exposure session. I'm taking a SUD score, subjective unit of distress. I'm not entering into that memory because this is their memory. I need them to fully feel it. But when we come out of the exposure session, we take place in something called debrief. Debrief allows me and the client to really discuss what were the memories, what they might have found, and then I work at the reconsolidation and bring new wisdom and insights into it. So the memory is still the same, but the emotional response that's connected to the memory is now lessening in that distress, if that makes sense to you. So again, research has found, I'll tell you, there was this group of researchers, and gosh, forgive me, I am forgetting their names. I can see the women's faces. I will find that and put the post show notes. But there are these researchers, and they said, okay, we're gonna see what this reconsolidation really, how it really works. So essentially, what they did is they brought individuals into the lab and they set them up on a computer. In addition, they had a device hooked up to one of their arms that gave them electrical shock. And then on their other hand, they had a conductive skin conduction device. So basically, if there was a fear response, your sweat glands would tell us that there's a fear response. So what they did is they brought these individuals into the lab and they sat them down in front of a computer screen, and they would flash this yellow square onto the computer screen. And so every time they put that yellow square on the computer screen, they would also pair it with an electrical charge. So it really hurt them. So, well, not really hurt them, but it hurt. So what they did is all of a sudden, if they put the yellow square on the screen, they get a charge, and that would show over on the sweat glands that there was a fear response. So they did this over and over and over again. What they learned is they created a feared response. Okay, this goes back to behavioralists like Pavlov's dogs. If you remember this back from your old psychology classes, he trained dogs to want food and not want food, and he created a stimulus that there was fear, okay, or there was a same reaction. So the bell became the same reaction as the food, and the dog salivated. So it's essentially the same thing. So these researchers created a feared response to a box on the screen, right, because of the electrical charge. So they sent the clients, the individuals, on their way. So they came back the next day And they thought, okay, now we need to undo this fear response that we created. So what they did is they would start showing the individual the yellow square without the electrical charge. And so eventually what happened was there was no longer a feared response. But what the researchers found in only doing this is that these people would come back and they would all of a sudden reacquire the feared response to the yellow square. Why? They taught the brain not to fear it, right? They took the electrical current away, but all of a sudden it came back, and they're saying, well, what happened? Well, what they're saying is the brain didn't know what to do. It had the relevant data of the first time I looked at that square, I got shocked and it caused me fear. But then over here, there's this yellow square that used to cause me pain, but now it's not causing me pain. And the brain said, nope, we're not going to believe this. We're going to go back to our feared response. So what these researchers said is we've got to figure out a way to turn this around, and it's called reconsolidation. And so what they then did is they brought them back in. They went through the whole process again. After that first feared response was created, then they debriefed and they talked about what did that shock mean? What happened with your body? They helped reform that emotional response associated with that square. And what did they find? It no longer had the effect. They did it that way. They took away the they had the same feared response, but they rewrote it. They talked to the individuals about it. And so it no longer had the effect on them that they had originally had before, just simply because they did this reconsolidation process. So that was some of the idea of it. Okay, so what is really interesting is that with this process is that it really implies that our memories are not rigid, that they can evolve, and it can lead us to personal growth and healing. That's not to say that this is about faking our memories, right? That's not it. We can't fake out our brain, as I just said with this research project. We have to reconsolidate in a very believable way to our brain. So it's about rewiring that emotional response. And so it's not about faking out our brain, but it is about creating a believable, different response. So Dr. Kent and her team took this idea and they applied it to exposure therapy. And they enhanced it with a medication called propranolol, if I said that right. So basically, this is a beta blocker that weakens your emotional responses during that memory reconsolidation process. What's interesting is I was on a beta blocker for years for a heart issue. So what Dr. Kent would do is that she would take individuals into the lab. And what's fascinating about her, she's both a researcher and a counselor. So she has a great series of Curing Fear. You can look it up on YouTube, where she really talks about how difficult it is as a counselor, where we are there to love and take care of our clients, and then as a researcher putting them through exposure, and that it's a very difficult place to stand. And I so empathized with what she was discussing, because I feel the same way. I tell my clients this exposure therapy is the way to go, and you will find a cure to your fear. You have to step into it, but you feel so terrible because you're asking them to relive some of the worst moments of their life. So it's heartbreaking. I know on the other end there's going to be relief, but it's very difficult to sit in that in between, and Dr. Kent talked about it too. So all that to be said, she would take individuals into the lab and expose them to their fear. And so I'm talking about enormous fear, awful, awful things, like a man that was afraid of a mouse, screaming and thrashing and get it away from me. And this little tiny mouse, and it's this giant man. And so she exposes people to the fear. And what happens during that time is she says, where are you at? Where are you at? Again, it goes back to the SUD scale. I do the same thing, subjective unit of distress. And this is basically saying on a scale of 0 to 100, how distressed are you? 100% is obviously, Piper, I hate you, get me out of here. 0 is there's no distress. So Dr. Kent would do that as well. Here's the key. If somebody comes into exposure therapy and one, they can't step fully into that memory, it won't work. It won't work. So we have to make sure that they're on a scale from like 70 to 100% to really ensure that we have stepped into that highly emotional memory. Okay. So after she did that, she would do the same process of reconsolidation, that debrief after, but in addition, she would give them this propranolol. What's so interesting is that combination of exposure and this medication offered a way more efficient way to update and change that feared memory, which she referred to as a cure for fear. However, again, it's really essential for you to remember as you're listening to this that it is absolutely transformative change that you can see. But it doesn't simply happen by acknowledging the idea of reconsolidation. Okay, it goes back to that you have to step into the full process, not just on a like logical level of, okay, I understand what reconsolidation is and it's going to work. It doesn't work that way. This process can take a lot of time and effort and a willingness to be vulnerable in partnership with me or another therapist. So, by integrating evidence based therapeutic methods such as exposure, we can focus on emotional well being, and the potential of that memory reconsolidation is truly unlocked. So, again, you have to be willing to step into this process. And again, it's a hard process for me to get my clients excited for. There's not a lot to be excited for when it comes to exposure therapy. For some of you that have listened to me for a long time, I myself have done this. I am a rape victim. And so I had to go through the exposure process myself. So I tell my clients that often because I don't want them to think that I'm just like some, awful masochist and wants to put them through these things just because. It's because I know that this is verified, effective therapeutic technique, and I have been through it myself. But here's the thing. I have found individuals that do not have success with exposure and reconsolidation due to maybe what the fear of life would be without it. Oftentimes people identify so deeply with this fear and that feared response, they can't imagine without that. Often I call this outcome resistance. This is part of my identity, so I don't really know that I want to do this because I would feel void without it. Um, so often what happens is that they hold on to the fear as an identity. And then there's other individuals that I've run into that they actually hold on to this trauma, this anxiety, whatever it is, almost out of like a penance for some sort of action that they had taken. Like, maybe they had, lost a loved one. And with that, I see a lot of times with grief therapy, people drink a lot to excess or they go and have sex a lot. And so there's this like awful shame that's attached to it. So they almost hold on to this distressing feeling of anxiety, phobias, traumas, whatever it is that they're coming for help with, but they can't let go of it because they think they need to pay penance for their actions. Other times I have had people where it is simply too great of an effort. It's too hard for their mind and they disassociate. Disassociate is really when people just kind of blip out. They're no longer in the room. This is a fascinating thing that the brain does to protect us. It's adaptive in many ways. It protects many of us from horrific traumas. But the problem is if we constantly keep using disassociation as an avoidance model, we just get worse and worse and worse. Disassociation feels okay in the short term, but it leaves a lot of gaps and it leaves you still with that pain. So there are some people in my work that this just doesn't work with. It doesn't work with. But for those of you that might be struggling with anxiety, phobias, or trauma related issues, this research with Dr. Kent really opens up new possibilities for treatment, and it provides more of a direct way to face and manage fears that hold us back. I so wish I could provide propranolol to my clients. I really do. It would be amazing to be able to do that. However, I can't. So we do the exposure process and we do the reconsolidation process. So let's kind of talk about what reconsolidation is. First, let's imagine memory reconsolidation is like renovating an old house. The house, in this case, represents your traumatic memory that's causing distress. Typically, the house's blueprint is fixed, right? Just like your long-term memory. But suppose you can change the blueprint. What if we could adjust and redesign and modify it so that our house or our memory serves us better and no longer holds us back? So think of it this way. We walk into a house, it looks like it's set the way it is, but then you look at the kitchen, you say, I need a bigger kitchen. So what do? You bring somebody in, they clear it out. You still have some of the main structure of that kitchen, right? The sink is here, the piping's there. You have the main structure, but they reconsolidate, they redesign the space. This is no different. That is what memory reconsolidation is all about. It allows us to remodel our house, our memory, and it's just wonderful process that we walk through. And so let me use an example, an everyday example for clarity. So let's say, for example, I'm working with a client named Jack. Jack has a caustic fear of heights due to a traumatic fall he experienced when he was young. This fear has held him back from fully enjoying a life, and he avoids, outdoor activities, travel, buildings, that sort of thing. So our first step would be to help Jack recall this memory and to bring it to the very central blueprint of his house, his traumatic memory, into his mind's eye. It's important that we revisit this memory, and it needs to be very distressing. Again, I need to have him in a high SUDS level or it really won't work. So during this time where I have the client recall, their eyes are closed and they're recalling the memory in first person, first person. I don't speak into the memory. I just periodically say, where are you at? And that's where I say to they know to, I prep them, they know to give me a SUD scale of 0 to 100%. So remember, I'm looking for like 70 to 900%, 60 to 100%. Otherwise, we're not going to have the effect that we need for the reconsolidation. Next, after we're done with the exposure session, we talk about Jack's memory. We allow him to feel the fear attached to it in that very safe and controlled environment. This is the debrief. And this is where I help remodel Jack's house. We work to change the emotional response attached to the memory of his fall. So, for example, we could imagine that the event happening with Jack was him, landing on a giant cushiony trampoline that gently bounces him back. This is silly, right? But here's the difference. He and I are coming up with this different scenario, but we're creating a different emotional response. If I say that to a grown man about, just imagine bouncing on a giant trampoline, he's going to guffaw at me. He's going to think that's the most ludicrous thing I've ever heard. But what did I do with that laughter? Even if it was a sarcastic laughter, I'm already changing the emotional response to the traumatic memory. We're making it more playful and safe. So, or for example, we can talk about what happened during the fall. Maybe he thought he could fly as a little boy. What does that look like if we can fly? Or what happened right after? Did your mother scoop you up and kiss you and love on you? Let's focus on the love and the affection and the safety that you felt during that time. Excuse me, everybody. So that's how we would approach that process. So throughout the reconsolidation process, we would consistently reinforce this revised memory. So Jack playing with that trampoline, or the love and affection he felt from his mother. So gradually, the memory of the fall becomes less distressing and less fear-inducing. Jack then starts to disassociate the heights with danger and begins to allow himself to ease into situations that he would have avoided before. Remember, though, that not everyone's blueprint or their memory is the same. It's unique. So the process can look different from person to person. And again, going back to what I said before, it requires trust, courage, patience, and often really solid guidance from a therapist that knows what they're doing. But again, the end result can be a transformed emotional response, and it's alleviated this distress. So essentially what it looks like is a renovated house has been built for growth and freedom. It's really, really exciting. So that's a little bit about, exposure therapy and reconsolidation. I hope it made sense to you today. As always, make sure when you hear anything on my podcast or other podcasts, you always consult with a mental health professional to discuss any of the approaches that you've heard in your individual therapeutic journey. And if you're wanting to take part in this with your therapist, make sure they know what they're doing. Ask them questions, inform yourself, do some research, because it really is a fabulous treatment, but it can be highly distressing. I also want to just put a little caveat and note in there. There is something called EMDR, eye movement desensitization. Reprogramming, I think. I do not do EMDR. Essentially, EMDR is a trauma-informed approach that allows you to also reframe those memories, and it has to do with bilateral stimulation. Again, here comes all those therapy words. I can even see you through the speakers glazing over. It's a wonderful approach. It allows you to step into the trauma without having to narrate it out loud. Why have I not done EMDR? Well, because exposure therapy in the way that I've done and reconsolidation is just as effective. And frankly, it is very expensive to get your certification with EMDR in the right way. You can do these one-off cheapo, certification things. I think that you need to go all the way with it. And I just don't honestly have the financial means to go ahead and do that. Whereas I know exposure therapy and the way that I do it in reconsolidation is just as effective. So remember, with everything that you've learned today, that you are absolutely capable of change and growth, and you can embrace these new perspectives and innovative treatment methods, and they can have a transformative impact on your life. I really suggest you look up Dr. Kint's work. Cure for Fear is found on YouTube. It's really fascinating. However, I will tell you there is a trigger warning with some of those things, so be very aware that it can be very distressing seeing people that are being thrust into their most traumatic fears. So again, I hope this was informative to you. If this is something that you're looking for in your own life and you're a Georgia resident, I would love to talk to you about how we can use exposure and reconsolidation for anxiety, trauma, all of those situations in your life, and really help you to have a life that's healthy, where you feel encouraged and supported, and you're empowered to overcome other issues in your upcoming years. So until then, stay grounded, keep nurturing your well-being, and I will talk to you next time. That brings us to the end of this episode. Thanks so much for joining me. I hope you learned some tools that can equip you to untangle your mind and untangle your life. If you're curious about working with me for anxiety, trauma, or grief, head on over to my website at untangledmind.net to connect with me and schedule a counseling session. If you've enjoyed the show, please rate and review me on your podcast listening platform and share it with your friends and family. As always, thanks so much for listening to the Untangled Mind podcast. I'll talk with you next time.